So Nietzsche would prefer, in fact, a world in which violence, at least violence in service of strength, is widespread, as opposed to a world in which human beings love each other, a world in which human beings honor their neighbors and serve each other. Service, love, honor, these are the sorts of values that weaken human beings, according to Nietzsche. Um, Nietzsche has a number of compelling ideas in support of uh, these um, these revisions of morality that he wants to offer. And in particular, as a backstory, I want to briefly to summarize for you the genealogy of morality, which is an important work that Nietzsche wrote about the time that he wrote The Twilight of the Idols, which is the text that we read for today. In the genealogy of morality, Nietzsche engages in a historical reconstruction project. This is a project where Nietzsche is trying to tease out what he thinks is the real history of morality and of moral development, as opposed to the received history. So the received history that I certainly was taught when I was growing up is that we have from the tradition, maybe from the Greeks, from the Romans, from the Jews, and from the Christian tradition, we have received a great and glorious set of values, values which are incredibly beneficial to human beings, which are worthwhile in themselves, which are intrinsically valuable to us, and which make us, when we practice these values, which make us into persons of um, persons of love, persons of obedience to God, persons who are living lives that are worth living. That's the tradition that I've been taught. At least that's the story that I've been taught about the reception of morality and of values down through the centuries in history. Uh, but Nietzsche says in the genealogy of morality that actually that received history is all wrong. That received history is in fact a big fraud. Um, and in the genealogy of morality, he goes back into the tradition to reconstruct what he believes to be the true origin of the moral values of the tradition that I just mentioned and that we've received. And that origin is a conspiracy theory. It's probably best characterized as a conspiracy theory. And it's a conspiracy launched by Jews. So bear with me here. This might seem initially to be far-fetched, but it's actually a very profound critique. One of the most original critiques to have been developed in the last several centuries in moral philosophy. And so listen closely as I tell the story as Nietzsche sees the story. The Jews throughout their history have been an oppressed people. Think back to the slavery in Egypt. Think also of the Babylonian exile. Think of the Assyrians sacking the cities of Samaria and the city of Samaria and besieging the city of Jerusalem. Think of the Romans oppressing the Jews in first century Palestine. The Jews in their history were oppressed peoples. And Nietzsche argues actually because of this oppression, because they were the downtrodden, the down and outs, the poor, the feeble, they developed a feeling of ressentiment, which is more or less roughly translated, pardon me, more or less roughly translated as resentment. And ressentiment was the feeling that they directed against the powerful who oppressed them. So the Jews oppressed by the Romans felt ressentiment against the Romans. And they were resentful in particular of the Romans' ability to dominate them. They were resentful of the Romans' power and of the Romans' ability to do whatever they wanted. And the Jews thought to themselves, how can we Jews, get what the Romans have? How can we become the powerful? And they realized when they thought about it that in fact they could not, by meeting power with power, conquer the Romans. At least this is as Nietzsche tells the story. They could not, meet the Romans in a pitched battle and win and become themselves, the Jews, the powerful. Instead, they devised another way, an alternative way to become powerful. And that alternative way was to get inside the Romans' heads. It was to develop ideas that the Jews thought the Romans could swallow. And these ideas operating inside the minds of the Romans would cause the Romans to cease to be powerful. I'm using the Romans in particular, although Nietzsche thinks that the Jews had hatched this conspiracy over a long period of time with respect to different people groups. So by getting inside the heads of the powerful, the Jews thought to themselves, we can become the powerful by controlling their minds. We can, through certain kinds of values, cause the powerful to become no longer powerful, and we can ourselves become the powerful by controlling their minds. And so, in service of this goal of becoming powerful, the Jews conspired together, and they launched the Christian religion. The Christian religion, Nietzsche argues, is founded by two Jews and a Jewess, so Jesus, Paul, and Mary. And together, these Jews developed a moral system which enfeebled the powerful, caused the powerful to become weak. So the moral system is the moral system that I've been taught, that we've been taught by our Christian tradition. It's a moral system of love, of kindness, of patience, of gentleness, and so forth. And that moral system, the Jews reasoned, when absorbed by the powerful, will cause them no longer to act as powerful, will cause them no longer to act in their capacity as powerful. When the powerful peoples of this world begin to try to love each other, or to be kind, or to be gentle, or to be patient, they will cease to oppress us, so the Jews reasoned. And we, the Jews, will become then the powerful by virtue of our thought control. Well, that's what Nietzsche thinks happened. That's what Nietzsche thinks is the history of Western morality. It's a history of the poor and the morality of the poor rising up and basically overthrowing the morality of the strong without the strong ever realizing that their moral system had been overthrown. So notice that's an important part of the story. The powerful peoples, like the Romans, did not realize when they were absorbing Judeo-Christian morality in the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, they didn't realize that, in fact, they were absorbing a moral system which would enfeeble them, which would weaken them. They thought that they were progressing. They thought that they were advancing morally. But in fact, all that had happened was they had succumbed to the Jewish conspiracy. So I think that it's important then, as we think about this alternative history that Nietzsche offers, we think about some of its intriguing aspects. Definitely, it's possible that many Jews were resentful of the wealthy and the powerful of this world. It's also possible that I think it's legitimate to say that the absorption of values of love and kindness by Romans caused them no longer to be as domineering or as controlling or maybe as desirous of power as they once were. So I think that those are legitimate kinds of points. Nietzsche thinks then that the story of Western morality, rather than being a story of advance, where morality gradually improves, it gradually gets better and human beings gradually get better and develop more civilized ways of interacting with each other, develop um, more open and honest and successful ways of interacting with each other. Instead of believing that and thinking that that's the story, Nietzsche, by contrast, thinks that in fact the story of Western morality is a story of decline. He thinks that we have been in decline ever since we absorbed the Judeo-Christian morality. Ever since we bought into the Judeo-Christian conspiracy, the moral conspiracy, we've been in decline. And think for a minute with me about how this could be. So, if you believe, as Nietzsche does, that the heroic virtues and the heroic societies of the Homeric era, think here of the Iliad and the Odyssey, if you believe that those are in fact the ideal ways for human beings to behave personally and also to interact with each other, then from a certain point of view, yes, Western morality is a story of decline. Nietzsche is fond of telling the story of eagles and lambs, as he calls it. If you look in the natural world, who wins in the natural world among the animals? The powerful do. The powerful animals win. The lions, the tigers, right? The bears, oh my. But the eagles, Nietzsche writes, they love to prey upon the little lambs. It's not as though the eagles ever think to themselves, should we really be preying upon the little lambs? It's not as though they ever form therapy groups, support groups, and they think, oh, I really shouldn't be exploiting the lambs like this. It's not like they do that at all. The eagles love lambs. They love eating lambs. They love exploiting tasty lambs. That's who they are as eagles. That's the way they naturally act. They are powerful, they are domineering, they are exploitative. That's what Nietzsche thinks is the ideal morality, the morality of power, where power is not cloaked in some mask, but where power is openly and freely expressed. Now, Nietzsche is writing in the 19th century, and he is writing at a time when the Christian worldview, or the dominance of the Christian worldview, is beginning to weaken in Western culture. And so many persons in Germany of his day and in continental Europe, even in America, many persons were beginning to wonder for the first time whether the Christian worldview was indeed correct. And some were rejecting the Christian worldview. And Nietzsche writes in Genealogy of Morality, and also in the book we're doing for today, Twilight of the Idols, Nietzsche writes that in fact the people around him who think that they are rejecting Christianity, at least some of the people of his day, and who think that they are rejecting Christian morality, are in fact actually continuing to uphold more or less the Judeo-Christian worldview. In a famous formula, Nietzsche says, we who consider ourselves to be enlightened atheists these days, we are still drinking the poison of the church. How could this be? This is paradoxical. Isn't finding freedom from Christian morality that is perceived to be oppressive, especially sexual morality or something like that, isn't finding that freedom one of the main goals of a lot of contemporary secular proponents? But think more closely about Nietzsche's critique. So I take it that some of the most prominent values that we have today in Western culture, especially in liberal democracies, are values like fairness, respect, equality. These are values, Nietzsche argues, that are actually descended from the Judeo-Christian moral conspiracy. Fairness, respect, equality, these values which are instantiated in the American Constitution, which are prominent in American